Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with Dr. Sandra Glahn. We are talking about her book, Nobody's Mother, where she discusses the Artemis cult in Greek culture and how that relates to the Bible, and specifically 1 Timothy 2 and other texts, and regarding the women in ministry discussion, as well as just what it means to be saved through childbearing, as Paul says it. So, how are you doing today, Dr. Glahn?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. All right. So, just for my audience, so they can understand the general outline of the book and all that, could you give us just a 5-10 minute summary of what you talked in your book?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's Artemis of the Ephesians and Antiquity and the New Testament. So not just Artemis.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way that there's a Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor and there's one in Paris and they look the same, but only one is connected with immigration. In a local city, a god or goddess can take on a certain flavor. And I was particularly interested to know who is Artemis of the Ephesians.
Mm-hmm.
And not only who is she, but who was she at the time of the earliest Christians. And the reason I was interested is not just because her temple was one of the 7 wonders of the world. It isn't just that Paul spent a couple of years there, both of which are important, or the inscriptions are loaded with information about her. It's because Acts 19 talks for pretty much a whole chapter on the spiritual dynamics happening in Ephesus. And the first part talks about magic workers and how Paul goes in and tackles that stronghold, and they'll give aprons and, handkerchiefs that Paul touches and people are healed. Consequently, the magic workers go burn their books. And then in the later part of that same chapter in Acts 19, you have a whole brouhaha that happens in Ephesus because the gospel is taking hold and it's cutting into the local economy. And Artemis is to Ephesus as Jesus is to Bethlehem. Okay. Like the city is famous for the birth of God to them. And so they're getting pilgrims. People are traveling from all over the empire. So the inns are making income, but the silver workers are particularly upset because the trinkets they're making out of silver of the temple are not selling as well, apparently. And they're going to blame Paul. And the people sort of rush into the theater, which is still there. I think the last public event was a Sting concert, and then they wrecked some of the old stones. So now you can't have a concert there, but you can still visit it. And they packed out the stadium and for 2 hours chanted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Well, I read that and thought, I wouldn't say great is Jesus of Dallas. Who is this specifically Artemis of the Ephesians? What does that have to do with 1 Timothy? Well, you go over to 1 Timothy, Paul has been in Ephesus, and we know he spent a couple of years there, but this disruption happens relating to Artemis, and he immediately leaves for Macedonia. So his letter to Timothy doesn't begin with grace and peace to you like you expect him to do in his other epistles. He starts out with this statement about Christ as Savior. And then he says, I left you in Ephesus to teach certain people, not to teach false doctrine. So we know Timothy's in Ephesus. We know he is tackling false doctrine. And for the longest time, I was reading in the English translation, certain men, that you would teach certain men not to teach false doctrine. So I just assumed it was men. But then I learned some Greek and discovered it was the word for people, which then raised the question of, were there women involved with false doctrine? And a little later, Paul talks about women who are going house to house gossiping, which sounds a little misogynistic, honestly. And you dig into the Greek and you find out the words translated there have a magic root to them. And maybe it could be going from house church to house church teaching nonsense relating to magic. And is there magic in Ephesus? Yes. How do we know? Well, primarily we know from Acts 19. So I didn't start with the inscriptions. I started with the book of Acts and the clues in the New Testament. So I began to ask, who is Artemis, and do we find Artemis-y words in 1 Timothy? Because one of the things that we find in 1 Timothy is so many single women, widows, that Paul tells them to divide them into 3 different groups to make sure they can eat. Why does this city have so many single women is a question I had to ask. Also, why does Paul begin with Savior and Lord? He goes against his usual salutations. So one of the first things I noticed is how many inscriptions refer to Artemis as Savior in Ephesus. So then I'm like, okay, is that like kryptonite is to Superman, that people would just know the minute you said a certain word who they're talking about without actually mentioning the name? You see it also in Titus, but Titus is also in Crete, which has a huge Artemis cult following there.
Hmm.
So it just raised the question for me, is it possible that false teaching that's on Paul's mind when he writes to Timothy is relating to the stronghold of this goddess? Because she is number 2 in the pantheon. And did I find her name in the inscriptions in Ephesus? I found them all over the place. Hundreds of inscriptions, if not thousands, bearing her name. And then you think about, okay, so who is she? Started playing around with the literary record, with the inscriptions, with the coins, with the statues, all these things that give us hints as to who she is. And we find that she is a confirmed virgin. And for the longest time, the church has taught she's a fertility goddess. She's the opposite. She is a not fertility goddess. She's often depicted wearing a short skirt so she can run, carrying a bow and arrow, seen with flanked either with dogs or deer. And so, but she's not like masculinized in those. She still looks really what we would call feminine. She's carrying a bow and arrow. If that's what she's known for, then I noticed in the same word that Homer uses to refer to her bow is a form of the word that Paul uses to talk about fiery darts of the devil. And he's writing to the Ephesians when he's talking about these fiery arrows. And you just wonder, is he giving a nod to the equipment that their primary goddess would have carried? So you don't have to know ancient archaeology to appreciate the fiery darts of the devil, right? You and I can still see that as something we need to armor up for. But also knowing that that's the number one stronghold in that city is Artemis worship, which, as I dug deeper, discovered the magic and Artemis were all related. It wasn't like separate forces. I found inscriptions to magic relating to Artemis, curses relating to Artemis, or charms. You know, they would appeal to her like love potion number 9. So they appeal to Artemis for supernatural power. The number one fear of women in Paul's world is dying in childbirth. That's the number one cause of death for women. War is the number one cause of death for men. Childbirth is for women. So I think my hypothesis is that when Paul talks about women being saved through childbearing, which was what I was most interested in, what does he mean by that? Because he can't mean eternally saved, because that would contradict every other thing he's ever taught about salvation by grace through faith, but also his instruction to the Corinthians to think about staying single, which he would never say if you're saved through childbearing, saved, from eternal separation from God by having babies. So, but that's the plainest sense of the language. What does saved mean there? And so a word study of that says, well, it either means something eternal or it means temporal, like delivered physically. It never has the sense of sanctified or preserved in that sort of way.
Right.
Long story short, I'm asking, who's Artemis of the time of the earliest Christians? Does that maybe inform? Do we find flavors of that in First Timothy, specifically in chapter 2, but also the whole book?
Yeah. No, it's something I really did appreciate about your book, which we talked about earlier, was that it's very scholarly. Like, you're mentioning all these different texts from the Greek world, stuff that most people are not going to be familiar with, don't even know exist, and just really helps to understand the background context of maybe what Paul is referring to, what Paul is the atmosphere that the Paul's hearers are in. Which is, of course, very important for understanding the Bible. Additionally, you talked, I think it was your first or second chapter, you talked about a little bit of history of women serving, which is really, really interesting, unexpected. I didn't expect to see that in the book, which was very helpful. But more in regard to the passage of 1 Timothy 2. So you have a whole chapter that mainly focuses on childbearing, and I want to talk about that a lot today. So before we get into that, I wanted to, just talk about just the basic context of the passage of what's before and maybe even what's after out a little bit. For my audience, I know everybody wants to talk about 1 Timothy 2:12 and can women preach or teach or not, and we might briefly talk about that today, but this topic's not primarily on that, but specifically on these preceding verses to the whole saved in childbearing thing. Could you talk about your general views or how we should understand that passage in general?
Well, if we look at the beginning of the passage, which is almost always left out of the conversation about women, we tend to just focus right at the beginning on, I'm not permitting a woman to speak or have authority. But what comes before that is a charge to either men or husbands, we're not sure which, to stop being angry and instead to lift holy hands. And one thing that we don't do from that is say, well, you have to lift your hands. We have to take Paul literally here, right? That we take him literally in that we see that as a sort of a symbolism for prayer, but we don't usually say, especially in non-charismatic circles, we don't say you have to lift your hands as Paul commands. But what's interesting to me about that is in Greek, as you probably know, the word for men or husband is the same word, and only context tells us, are we talking about husbands here? Or are we talking about men? And the same is true then later in the passage. Are we talking about women? Are we talking about wives? And only context tells you. But what I find interesting is in a context where you have childbearing in view, would you say that's women or wives? Well, in Pauline sexuality, I would say wives. And then when you sort of look at his outline of the things that a widow is supposed to be, which is later in the passage, the qualifications for a widow are very parallel to the qualifications for an elder, down to being the wife of one husband, husband of one wife, which we have tended to say, well, that Paul's talking about who can eat, who can get food. Except that's not how we treat the poor. We don't vet them according to whether they've been married, whether they've been, right? And so that's a whole other issue. But I think it's related because, again, it shows that there are a whole lot of single women in this church, but not every church in the world everywhere has a whole lot of single women. Do we always need 3 categories for widows in every church? And then we find out that the word widow didn't necessarily always mean that you had lost a husband. In the ancient world, it was the word for without a man, woman, which was almost always somebody who we would call widowed, because it's so rare to be a single gal in the ancient world. They had arranged marriage. It wasn't like they were waiting around to fall in love. Like if it's time for you to marry, mom and dad go find you somebody and you're going to marry. And even when Paul gives instructions about marriage, I think he's assuming arranged marriages. I'm happy that I'm not in an arranged marriage. I'm just saying we have some cultural differences. So we begin the passage with a command to either men or husbands because something's wrong. And I think there is a pairing then with, he begins with the men and then the women. And we tend to focus only on some restrictions to women. Also, don't extrapolate saying, well, all men are typically angry because Paul commands them not to be angry. I don't think his point is that he's saying something innate about men here. I think there's something going on in the church that he is having Timothy address. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that when you get to the section on women and what he's saying, there just about every word is fraught. But we begin with, I want women to dress modestly, decency, propriety, but then the very next line is about elaborate hair, gold, pearls, expensive clothes. All of those are economic concerns. We have made them sexual concerns, which of course the word decency suggests that, but we've turned it into a whole purity culture thing of policing how women are responsible for men's thoughts, when in the church in Ephesus, a big problem was greed and money. You'll see a ton of references to that. And Ephesus is a very wealthy city. It's on the shore. They're probably better fed than most people, because if you're near an ocean, you have the protein coming off the ocean. We know from the inscriptions that there is a stream going by Artemis's temple that has a certain kind of sacred fish, and they're getting taxes from selling those. Ephesus is known for a certain kind of fish sauce that people long for in other parts of the empire. So there are probably lots of pearls. Oysters tend to grow in the ocean inside. Oysters. Yeah, sorry. Pearls tend to grow inside oysters on the ocean. And so Paul's reference to pearls there, they don't have fake pearls in his world. They don't have cubic zirconia. If people are wearing gold and pearls, they're real. Today, I can wear costume jewelry all the time and nobody knows if it's real or fake. And even if it's real, nobody really knows or cares because it might be fake. But in Paul's world, if you're showing up in the assembly of the equal, and you have a hairstyle that suggests you needed slave labor to do it, because it took a very long time to do my kind of hair, which a lot of them had, to put it up in the kind of elaborate braids that would have been involved that we sometimes see in the statues. That required slave labor, and it required downtime to just sit and be pampered. And so his reference to hairstyles, gold and pearls, expensive clothes, is a nod to the kind of modesty. We use the word modesty in the same way. He lives in a modest house. She drives a modest car. That's not our primary meaning, but I think that is Paul's primary meaning here. So there seems to be some flaunting happening on the part of, and I would argue, the wives. Certainly all women should dress modestly, which is what people usually say, well, you don't want anybody to be provocative. But I think it's more a call to the wives to stop showing off their status. And a wife is going to, become a wife around age 15. So before that time, she and her husband are going to be policing how their daughter dresses and how much gold she's flaunting. So I just don't see this as a command to all women as much as a direction to wives to leave their economic signs at home. A parallel in the US might be, not to walk into church with all the signs of your wealth in a way that is off-putting, in a way that shows that your status in your world is that you have power and you have financial power. So he wants them instead to clothe themselves with kindness, with the fruit of the Spirit. We see it over in Peter, a similar instruction to clothe yourself in humility. So that is also part of the preface going into Paul's instruction, limiting what women or wives are going to do in terms of speaking. And then we get to, for I am not allowing, but before that, he gives a couple of creation references. So he mentions that Adam is first, not Eve, and that Adam is deceived. I think Paul, and then mentions childbearing. So I think Paul is giving us a little midrash, or he's following the outline of the book of Genesis. What I think is significant here in terms of Artemis studies begins with Homer, and Homer tells about the birth of Artemis. There are a couple different versions of the birth of Artemis, but basically the one that is most essential to Ephesus is Zeus is the big daddy god, and Zeus is married to Hera, but he cheats on Hera with Leto, and Leto gets pregnant with twins. Leto is floating around the Greek Isles looking for a friendly place to give birth, and nobody wants to be hospitable to her because they don't want to hack off the powerful Hera. But she finds a little grove called Ortygia near Ephesus, and Artemis is born first. So she's preeminent. And gods and goddesses, unlike humans, are not born as cherubs or babies. They're more, I call them bonsai people, in that they're little and tiny, but they're in full use of their faculties, full use of vocabulary and wisdom and understanding. They don't have to grow in stature. And so Artemis is tiny, but she has full use of her faculties and assists her mother, who writhes for 9 days, suffering as she gives birth to Apollo, Artemis's twin. So you have Artemis, and I did a search on Apollo's name and inscriptions just to see how often he showed up in Ephesus. I found 0. He's got his own. They put him off on Delos and give him his own story over there. Yeah. So that hints at the absence of something, hints at something there. So Artemis is first, and we will see firstness sometimes show up in references to her. She's called the goddess of the first throne. And so it's possible, I think, that Paul is saying, I'll give you a first. Adam was first, actually. So he's correcting an origin story with the real origin story. And not only was he first, the woman was deceived. So get off your high horse about. So I think that Paul is bringing an equalizing force to a place where you have a preeminent goddess. So consequently, the way I understand it, you have false teaching. It relates to this virgin goddess. We're going to correct her origin story in the city of the origin story with the real origin story. And Paul then in the first person says, I'm not allowing. And then the question is a woman or a wife. So what's interesting to me about that is Paul doesn't say women should never or women don't or any kind of principle. The principle he gives is how they should learn. So a woman should learn how in quietness and full submission. That's actually an imperative. So it's the only imperative in the passages, which is let a woman learn in quietness and full submission. And that sometimes gets lost in translation, right? We see a gentle imperative there, a woman should learn, but it doesn't have the same kind of feel as let a woman learn in quietness and full submission, which suggests that the way they've been learning has been a problem. Maybe in the same way that the men have been angry, the women have had an attitude in how they've learned that has not been Christ-like. And then he switches to the first person and says, I'm not allowing. And again, a woman or a wife? Are we talking about? The reason I think here also he might be meaning wives is because one of Paul's favorite words relating to wives is submission. And we see that in his book to the Ephesians. So Ephesus, Ephesians, that's a whole other discussion. But there are a number of reasons to see this passage as directed to wives rather than women in general. I'm not going to come down 100%. I'm just going to say the language there really leaves, and the context of childbearing leaves open the possibility that there's a husband and wife conflict happening. Then he's trying to give them both some instruction to settle things down. So then he says, I'm not allowing a woman, I'm allowing a woman or wife neither to teach nor, and then the word authentain, which is a challenge because it's not the usual word for authority, which is exousia, which appears all over the New Testament. Authentain only appears here. And what does it mean? The KJV translators rendered it to usurp authority. And then the question is over a man or a husband, right? You see how many different possible, and this is part of why there are many, many books written on this passage. Sure. Are we talking to husbands and wives? Are we talking, does the submission flag wives? Does childbearing flag wives? Why does Paul say, I'm not permitting? Is he talking then about something specific to this situation and counsel that he's giving to it? It just seems strange that he doesn't say a woman should never. And then when you think about Paul's instruction to the Corinthians, he actually ranks the spiritual gifts as apostles and then prophets and then teachers. So he's putting prophets above, if you will, or he's building it the other way. The foundation is the apostles and then the prophets and the teachers. And he talks about women prophesying. You have, when you pray and prophesy, do something with your hair. But he assumes in the churches that women or wives are going to be prophesying, which is more authoritative than teaching. So that raises a question of why would he shut down teaching on the part of woman for all time, but leave open prophesying for women or wives? And then is it a certain kind of authority, or is it any kind of authority at all? And is it over all men, or is it usurping authority, and is it just over husbands? Complicated. So Paul's given a limitation, and then he started with the origin story, and he's given a limitation, but then he goes on to show us 13. Why not? We're here.
Okay. Here you go.
For Adam was formed first, and then Eve. So he's given a limitation on them, and then his rationale for it is creation from Genesis, which would totally contradict the creation story that the Gentiles that are coming to Christ would believe. And even the woman was deceived. Now, we know Paul doesn't think women are more easily deceived than men as a class, because to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, he says to the whole church, I'm concerned for all of you that you be deceived as Eve was. Deception and vulnerability to deception as a class is applied to all humans. And we see it starting in Genesis 3 in the garden. Both the man and the woman sinned in their different ways. And some could even argue, yeah, but she thought she was doing good. He actually full on knew he wasn't. That's a whole other debate, but it comes into play here. Is Paul making this a statement about all women for all time, and that women are just more easily deceived? That, as you referenced the church history, is how a lot of the early church interpreted it. And what's interesting about that is the modern complementarians stopped calling themselves traditionalists, partly for that reason, because they wanted to distance themselves from a tradition that said women are more easily deceived than men as a class. And so we don't tend to follow the tradition on that and say that women are completely more deceived than men. So he's given a limitation, he's given a rationale for it, and then he gives the part that I've been most focused on, which is, but women, it's actually, and there's probably a little note there, because in the Greek it's singular. It's actually not the word women, it's she will be saved through. And then there's the word the childbearing, which sometimes could refer to a specific one, but not necessarily. So here are the new questions we have. Why does Paul say she will be saved if they continue in faith?
Right.
Paul is a really good grammarian. He knows that you have to match that. So my hypothesis here is that she will be saved through childbearing is a local saying. Paul constantly is borrowing. You think about Mars Hill when he says, one of your own poets says, it's in him we live and move and have our being. Paul loves to quote the local culture and then put his Christian spin on it. I think he is saying she'll be saved through childbearing and then putting a Christian spin if they continue in the faith with holiness, with propriety. What's interesting to me is the very next line, which we put with the next chapter, but the chapter divisions are not, of course, inspired. This is a trustworthy saying. So we've added a new paragraph to, and put a colon after it, but it's very possible that he is taking a saying and he's making it trustworthy. Yep, they'll be saved or delivered if basically they continue in the faith. So here's my hypothesis. In the same way that Paul tackled the stronghold of magic workers by doing miracles that were not for all time, but that showed Jesus is better, Jesus is stronger in the stronghold in that city, I think he's doing the same thing with the goddess of midwifery in Ephesus. She is known for being a midwife in Ephesus in a way that she is not known for being a midwife around the rest of the empire, in the same way that Lady Liberty is immigration only in New York Harbor. But that she's still the same Lady Liberty. She just has a local flavor. And I think he is taking on the stronghold of the biggest fear that a new Christian is going to have, which is, do I need to hedge my bets? Do I need to go to the temple and make sure? Because I'm going to have a baby, and that's the thing that, is what kills people. And Paul's saying they're not going to die. I don't think it's for all time. I don't think it's for every church. I think it's in the backyard of the goddess of midwifery. He's telling Timothy, Jesus is better. And he's able to do miracles, particularly as we're establishing the early church.
Yeah, that'd be really cool to talk about. All right, I do appreciate the long overview there. That was very helpful, and that'll be great for the discussion here. So, so my first question of you briefly mentioned it. Was there any other things that you wanted people to know about that really give an indication that Paul is speaking to an audience that is very familiar with the Artemis culture, and therefore the things he's talking about is going to be related to Artemis in some way.
Well, yes, great question. Just in the beginning of First Timothy 1, when he introduces, greetings, we see a number of different titles that we also see all over the inscriptions for Artemis. So just, verses 1 through 3, First Timothy 1, 1 through 3, it's almost like he pulls out the full armor to say Jesus is Lord, Jesus is Savior, Jesus is God. And I left you in Ephesus to teach certain people, not to teach falsehood. And those are common titles that relate to her. And as I mentioned, first throne, first protos. Protos shows up in some of her titles, and protos shows up in his reference to Adam. So a question that comes up, which is a really legitimate question, is, well, why doesn't Paul ever mention Artemis? And if you read the entire Pauline corpus in the entire Bible, you will never see Paul mention the name of any other God. He's a good Jew. And even though he, has come to Christ, you never see him mention the name of another God. Now, Luke, who's probably coming out of a Gentile background, he'll say, yeah, they were calling us Hermes, and, oh, the ship had, and he'll name the name of a God that's on the masthead or something. Luke doesn't hesitate to say the name of a God. Paul never acknowledges. And even the city clerk in Ephesus says they haven't blasphemed our goddess. They've just said gods made with hands aren't gods. And that's how Paul works. He never comes in and says, Artemis, throw down her statues, overthrow it. He's just like, well, she's made with hands. You do the math. And it's harder to pin him with blasphemy, even though he's really undercutting their beliefs.
So you think that he is saying this not as like a polemical thing, like not even worth mentioning their names, but I guess to not be so someone can't say, hey, you're blaspheming?
I think part of it is a missiological strategy, but part of it is his Jewishness that says we do not utter the name of a false god. It doesn't pass our lips.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Definitely a lot of scholars hold that position. So that's kind of the background context. You went through the Artemis creation story there. I mean, not the whole thing, but a good little summary. Was there anything else you wanted to add about that?
Just that there are a number of them, but all of them point to her being the goddess of euthanizing arrows, that she is the twin of Apollo, that she is a confirmed virgin. So when Artemis saw her mother writhing for 9 days, she goes to Daddy Zeus and strokes his beard, which is the equivalent of wrapping him around her finger, and says, I want you to make me immune to Aphrodite's arrows. She didn't want to do love, sex, childbirth, none of that. I won't make me a confirmed virgin. And her father says, granted, in fact, I'll give you lots of cities. And she's like, I don't really care about the cities and men. I want to hunt. So all of that seems to come up indirectly. And I think the fact that there are so many single women in this city. N.T. Wright says we tend to be like what we worship. And I think that you see that in Ephesus.
Yeah, it makes sense. All right, so you briefly talked about it. Was there any other arguments that you wanted to mention? And specifically 1 Timothy 2:13-15. I'll read it here. So this is right after talking about women being silent. It says, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived, but it was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. Any additional readings or additional evidence you wanted to mention that maybe gives you this idea that maybe Paul is kind of polemicizing or saying, hey, this is the real one, not this other Artemis idea?
I do think Paul's being overt in Paul's way. I think he's taking her on head on, and the false teaching head on, and the fact that it is going from house to house. We tend to read women going house to house and think backdoor patio, but that's how the church is described as meeting in this era.
Mm.
And so it's probably much more nefarious than that. Also, I think it's really important to consider that if we continue to teach that Adam being first means the silence of women, that it raises a question about the entire counsel of God, because it is rooted in creation, like in the ideal state. But if that's the case, why is God raising up any female prophets? Why do we have Miriam? Why do we have Huldah? Why do we have Philip's 3 daughters? Why do we have the women in the church that need to cover their hair or put their hair up or whatever it is that's happening? Why do we have apparently women prophesying in the assembly in Corinth? If God is bringing speech to women in public settings where men and women are present, how do we reconcile that? It's tough to reconcile.
Yeah, right. Yeah, especially the idea that, women are all deceived and like unable to, or not as good teachers or something like that, compared to men. It doesn't really make much sense with the given context of the rest of the times where God has people doing that. And
it doesn't fit Paul's practice, which he lays out in Romans 16. In Romans 16, which we tend to just gloss over, but he's giving all these greetings, and he starts with Phoebe, a deacon, and he mentions Junia, an apostle, and he talks about Rufus's mom, who's a mom to him, and Tryphena and Tryphosa, his co-workers. Like, Paul's practice is partnering with women and men in ministry, and then you get to the art of the early church, and you see men and women at the altar together. You see men and women partnering. Since Pentecost, where women and men are both filled with the Spirit, the new priesthood is the priesthood of all believers.
Yeah. Okay. So what about this whole saved through childbearing idea? So I'm not familiar with local sayings in any way at all. So I'm with my audience on this one. But like, well, for one, if I never even heard like, oh yeah, the verses are not actually in the original text, so I'll put it on the screen. This is your proposed reading of, like, if we just ignore how the verses were separated, which were separated by people much later, then this would make a lot of sense that she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Here is a trustworthy saying. So like that makes sense, but like maybe could you talk about what reasons there are to think that this is possibly a saying? Like, of course, Paul talks about other sayings in other texts, right?
So I did this whole thing, which is laid out in the book, of looking at all of Paul's trustworthy sayings. And one of the things that I discovered is that they all either have the word saved or have the idea of salvation in them. And if we put this as a trustworthy saying with anyone, someone desires to be an elder, that person desires a good thing, that has nothing to do with salvation. So the first thing is his trustworthy sayings that he picks, at least in his work in the pastoral epistles, tends to relate to salvation in some way. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is actually the word saying is just right there in the context, and there's a reason to believe it's a saying if he changes the grammar. And a third reason to think it's a saying is she's the goddess of saving people through childbearing. She would either save them through euthanizing them painlessly with her arrows, it was thought, or kill them quickly, right? Or deliver them. And this is what people would pray to Artemis. So does that seem to match Paul's approach? Sure. Go in, find out what people are relying on the local God for, and show that Jesus is better. Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And do we have, maybe this is not a topic or a question for you, but do we have other texts in the ancient world that use this phrase? It's like, here is a trustworthy saying.
I don't see it like in the Greek inscriptions. That seems to be a thing Paul likes to do. And Paul likes to take a local saying, like it's good for a man not to touch a woman, and then add but, and again, give it his own Christian spin. And they're so common that a lot of our English translations add the quotation marks. But again, there are no quotation marks in Greek. It's part of the challenge for us because
Right.
one, the punctuation is there. So we're trying to figure out, where do I put a colon? Where do I put a comma? Where does the period end the sentence? And yes, as you mentioned, then we get the verse changes and the chapter divisions, which came much later.
Right. And then you have to figure out, what is Paul even doing with the quote in general. So it's not just simple, like, is he taking all of the meaning from the original quote,
Right.
or
Yeah. All of that.
yeah, super complicated stuff. So in your book, you also talked about how women in the ancient world, they saw the death as a problem in childbirth. Could you go into more detail about that, and possibly how might someone in reading First Timothy here would respond to that, or perceive this idea?
So picture a world in urban Ephesus. If you're living in an urban setting, you can hear through the walls. There's no such thing as soundproof walls. And so pretty much everybody in an urban setting would have heard a woman giving birth, and would heard screaming. They didn't have epidurals, and they didn't have C-sections. So if you think of anybody that you know who had preeclampsia or a C-section, or the baby wasn't turned or whatever, like the only thing worse than dying in childbirth is dying after 9 days of writhing. It's just a horrible way to die, and it's terrifying. And so fear is a really strong motivator, I have to say. Fear of death, not the least. So we do have evidence that anytime somebody went through a major transition, including childbirth, they would take offerings to Artemis's temple. So, for example, let's say you've been a silver worker all your life and you're getting ready to retire. You would take the tools of your trade and offer them to her. And her temple in that way was almost like a museum, because it had some of the best implements that people had offered the goddess. So you're terrified, not only if you're a woman who's pregnant, but if you love somebody who is, or if it's your wife, or if it's your daughter, or if it's your niece, or if it's your friend. It's the number one thing that's killing women. And of course, you add to that the emperors some decades earlier made a rule that a woman, if she wanted to get out from under male authority, a citizen woman, if she had, I think it's 3, and I think if it's a manumitted woman had 4. I'm not sure exactly. It's either 3 or 4, or 2 or 3. Pretty sure it was 3 or 4. Anyway, there's an incentive for females to give birth because the emperor wants an army. And as I mentioned earlier, the number one reason for men's death is war. And the way that you get an army is providing incentives. He's requiring men to marry, hurry up and get past your engagement and tie the knot because I need babies. And actually, in the early church, I think this might be part of why we see so much confirmed virginity. I think in some ways it was a reaction, not purity culture, but a reaction against empire and the violence of empire, and a refusal to participate in the whole machine that was empire. So childbirth is related to empire, not just family building. And it's terrifying because you don't have the modern medicine to prolong life or to deliver a child. You can't do surgery to open up a woman and take the baby out without taking her life. So people are very conscious of war and baby making, and it makes sense that their goddess answers those things for them. So picture a new Christian. You've been worshiping Artemis, you're part of the whole worship thing, and now you have a new loyalty. It's to Jesus Christ. And this might be the first time that your commitment to him, where the rubber has to meet the road. Am I really willing? Do I believe enough to risk hacking off the goddess who might be real? Do I go hedge my bets at the temple? That's where you might have people really wrestling with syncretism. Well, maybe I can appease Artemis, but Jesus is, the number one God. They would have been used to that in the pantheon, right? Just take care of all their altars and then everybody's happy. And that's not the way Jesus works. So it would have been a real challenge. Childbirth would have been a challenge, not just for women, but for men. I think in the same way that you see a lot of men who adore the Virgin Mary in Catholicism, it's not a woman's cult. Artemis worship is not just for women. If you think about silver workers, they're men.
So actually, no, talk about that a little bit more. So you said the Artemis cult's not just about men. So specifically, like what is the importance here in regards to the context? Like, why is that important for men? Or
Well,
you just mentioned that?
It's important because it's Paul's concern is not just I think he is showing a pastoral concern for women, but I don't think it's just that. I think his greater concern is that Jesus is stronger than any stronghold that you have, whether it's magic, whether it's Artemis, but it's not like the men are doing magic and the women are doing Artemis, is I guess my point. It's that this people are coming from all over the empire to worship Artemis. And literally, like, I found Artemis of the Ephesian statues in Jordan, modern Jordan. Like, you can recognize it's a pretty funky looking statue. And they had both kinds of statues of Artemis in the temple at the time of the earliest Christian. They had both the woman in the short skirt with her bow and arrow, and the one with these bulbous appendages all over her that we now think were probably Hittite magic sacks, which connects Artemis with magic. So it's men and women. It's just Ephesians. The whole city has gone after her and derives their trade and their identity from her temple and her worship, which they didn't have a dichotomy in their thinking between religion and social life or municipal spaces. It's just all, there's a month for Artemis birthday celebration. There's a parade. There's they didn't have a day off like the Jewish Sabbath, so every day of the week is temple's open.
Yeah, right. So more on that save through childbearing phrase. So I'm going to put it back onto the screen here. But for one, was there any other reasons you might think that this might be in reference to Artemis? I mean, it is just obvious that it's just a crazy coincidence that he just happens to be writing to the city that is known for Artemis and childbearing and all that, and then in this letter he just happens to be talking about saved through childbearing. But is there any other evidence that you haven't mentioned that maybe could help my audience see another reason to take this view that you're holding here?
Well, just to zero back in on the word saved, it's to get fancy, it's in the future passive form, which means will be saved. The salvation will happen unto her. But so she will be saved. There are really two uses of will be saved in the New Testament. It's either will be saved eternally or will be saved temporally. That's how the word is used. So we have stretched it to mean sanctified, because here's how the logic has gone on that. Well, it must have to mean sanctified only here, because Paul can't be meaning all women will be saved through childbearing, because women die in childbearing. That is a backwards way to approach the New Testament. Okay? We look at how Paul uses words, and those are the two ways: either mortality or eternality. And we know it's not eternality because that contradicts everything else Paul's ever said about the gospel and salvation, and what he said to the Corinthians about consider staying single for the sake of the gospel. So then you ask, well, if he's saying a woman will be preserved, if you will, through the process of childbearing, then how do you reconcile that not all women everywhere are? And what does that have to do with Adam being first and the woman being deceived? Right. How does that logically follow? Well, it follows the outline of Genesis and that origin story, and in the city where there's a different origin story. So I think he's having a little fun with the outline of Genesis and then just applying it to Timothy's situation that has to do with false doctrine. What hints do we get about the false doctrine in Ephesus? We don't have to go to the inscriptions for that. It's right there in Acts 19. Magic, Artemis, huge stronghold on the city.
Yeah. So I was really curious. I don't know if you've done any postulating. I don't know if that's even the word, postulating. But if so for Paul to say, hey, they would be saved through childbearing, or however you want to translate that, the does that mean like Paul got this message like straight from God? Like God was like, hey, yeah, I'm gonna, help these guys out in the local city, or women specifically, and or was
Yeah.
like this is like a, I don't know, a predictive thing that Paul is making. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So again, I think we get our hints from Acts 19. How in the world can people touch Paul with their aprons and kerchiefs and then go touch a sick person and they're healed? Something supernatural is going on. Why do we not make that normative? Well, because it's in a context of magic workers. And
Mm.
does it work? Yeah, the magic workers are like, holy moly, our magic doesn't do this. Let's burn our books because Jesus is better. And I think it is Paul's missiology to identify whatever the stronghold is spiritually in a site, in a setting, and go after it with Jesus is better.
Mm.
I don't know how Paul knew that them touching handkerchiefs to him would heal.
Yeah.
But also, I would never say that that's normative. I know there are some denominations that think people have the gifts of healing that work that way. I don't belong to those denominations. I think there's something specific happening. But I will say this. So my husband works in East Africa with East West Ministries, and we work with the nationals there in church planting.
Mm.
And one of the things you see in areas where you are just entering with the gospel is that there's often a confrontation that involves miracles with whatever the local stronghold is. You might have a village elder who's tried everything and is ill, and a Christian comes in, lays hands on them, and they're healed. And people are like, whoa. Or a witch doctor whose, supernatural stuff hasn't worked. Does that mean Jesus is honor bound to heal every person that's sick? No.
Mm.
You often see in mission settings in particular that the first thing that happens is some amazing thing that takes on the local beliefs and demonstrates that Jesus is better. And I think that is probably what's going on here.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so uh, so for many, this phrase of "saved through childbearing" makes little sense, and the specific context of the passage is just like seems all over the place. Like you have these random mentions of clothing and men being mad, and then all of a sudden, no, women can't teach and they have to listen, and then all of a sudden it mentions Adam and Eve, and then it mentions this, saved through childbearing. So could you, I mean, you don't have to go too much in detail on this, but could you, just for clarity, I guess maybe describe how you see in your view, like the point that the way that Paul is connecting those dots.
Paul's logic here.
Yeah. So and it's certainly possible, maybe Paul's just saying, hey, like I should say this about that, and then, oh, yeah, I guess this is a completely unrelated point, but also
No.
mention
I think
this.
he's following an outline out
Okay.
of this. So, okay, I'm not 100% on this. This is my hunch based on all the work I've been doing. My
Okay.
hunch is there's a conflict in the church between husbands and wives that relates to the fact that women, even though Artemis's cult isn't just for women, in the temple worship, women, particularly women who are not sexually active, are very much a part of the exercise in the temple, and they hold high positions, and we see some different positions that they can hold. And but they have not been, Gentile women have not been taught the Hebrew scriptures. And so, but they're used to coming in and being in charge. I don't see it as feminism. I don't see it as women taking over as much as they're used to being purveyors of content. And so there's something going on in the husband-wife relationship in public that's not good. He wants the husbands to settle down and pray. And so the husbands are given a certain kind of speech, which is to pray. And the wives are to learn a different way. Their attitude and how they've been learning has not been Christ honoring. So he wants them to be silent. This doesn't silence all women for all time. There's a problem going on. And with a certain attitude, but let them learn. Let them learn a certain way, but let them learn. Because why? Because the goal is to correct false teaching. And the way to correct false teaching is with proper teaching, and to shut down or silence the teaching that's been happening. So the short-term solution is let them learn. And he's not permitting a wife to teach a husband or to usurp his authority, or basically he's silencing women, I think, for a time. Or so women are up here and men are down here. And he's like, well, actually, Adam was first and the woman was deceived, which brings them to an equal plane. But because I'm silencing women for a time, I'm also going to give them a time-bound benefit, which is, okay, I'm taking something away, but also I'm actually addressing your biggest fear that relates to all this false teaching. And that is, Jesus is better. And this is a faithful saying. Timothy would have totally known what he was talking about. It is a personal letter. It is scripture, of course, but we tend to read it as a letter to the church and even say things like Paul tells us. Well, Paul told Timothy, and then we can draw from that. I think one of the things that we've drawn from it is the silencing of women. What we should have drawn from it is when you walk into a place with a stronghold, you present Jesus as better, because he is.
Yeah. You're right. I do appreciate that. Makes a lot of sense. All right. So last question, most likely here. So actually, before we do that, could you give us just where people can get your book?
Sure.
Anything else you're working on? Anything like that? Yeah.
Sure. Nobody's Mother is the name of the book, and the subtitle, Artemis of the Ephesians and Antiquity and the New Testament. But you don't have to know that. Just Nobody's Mother, Sandra Glahn, Glahn. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on my website at sandraglahn.com, but Glahn, you might forget how to spell it. Amazon's easier to spell. So that's probably the easiest place to get it. I'm not a huge fan of Amazon, but it's the easiest place to get it.
Awesome. All right. And anything else you're working on that we can expect from you in the future?
Sure. So my next work, I'm under contract with IVP Academic, is called A Woman's Place is in the Story. First we told the Bible story and kind of skipped over women. And then we started cameoing them and did like women of the Bible, which is perfectly appropriate because it had been missing. This looks at, okay, what if we just tell the story and include the women and the men? I should have brought water. Oh, wait,
Take your time.
Yeah, thanks. Ooh. It's allergy season. Okay.
Yeah, you were talking about your book, or your future work.
Oh, thank you. So, A Woman's Place in the Story relooks at the Bible, just telling the stories that include women. So instead of the story of Abraham, it's really the story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. And we have tended to skip over the midwives in Exodus, but that deliver Moses, but they are named by name, which is significant. Also, the daughters of Vilified, ever heard of them? They're mentioned 5 times in the Old Testament. Maybe people that are mentioned 5 times, we should go back and pay attention to them. So just relooking at the whole story of Scripture and telling it, involving men and women as partners. I'm much less about being pro-women than I am about being pro-men and women. I think we need each other. And I don't think we have to resort to stereotype to say how we need each other. Some of that I think is a mystery. I think biblical manhood is the fruit of the Spirit in a male body, and biblical womanhood is the fruit of the Spirit in a female body. Men and women are both called to gentleness, but it might look different. But so anyway, that's my biggest passion program. That's my biggest passion at the moment, is working on that work.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Last question here. So this is something that you hit like very in the beginning of the book and you kind of went on as you go, but this idea from previous, specifically like one or two egalitarians that was like, yeah, so the Artemis cult, Paul is responding to them because they are a fertility cult. It's a
Yeah.
fertility goddess. Could you talk about why someone might have concluded that, and maybe what's the better interpretation?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So yeah, the founders of Christians for Biblical Equality did see Artemis in Acts 19, and they went to Ephesus, and they wrongly, I would say, concluded that Artemis was a fertility goddess. So they did see Paul addressing that, but they really said she was the opposite of what the evidence suggests she is, and that makes us really look bad to historians who know better, that she was anything but. She was the opposite of a fertility goddess. And honestly, a lot of us were taught that there is temple prostitution in the New Testament world. There is not a shred of evidence that that ever was a thing. People have said, well, yes, but Strabo, the historian, talks about, the orgies that are happening on the hill in Corinth. Well, he's referring to something that he thinks happened centuries before his time. It's completely hearsay, and evidence isn't there. So all that to say, they actually, I think, got some of their cues on that from Jerome in the 4th century. Jerome refers to this particular manifestation that has the bulbous appendages as polymaston, or many-breasted. And as I mentioned earlier, these are probably not breasts. For one thing, they're pretty low. For another thing, the neck piece, or the necklace, if you do look at it close up, it's the same shape. We also have statues of Zeus with the same frontal pecs. We also have manifestations of the same goddess with her toes and her hands and her face ebony, but the rest of her is marble, which suggests it's something that she put on rather than being her skin. And just for a number of different reasons, not the least of which, everything talks about her as being a virgin. Nothing talks about prostitution or any sort of immorality or even sexual activity, even monogamous. That's just not who Artemis is. And that is the overwhelming evidence of everything, from the inscriptions to the writings to the coins to any evidence you look at that is devoted to the time of the earliest Christians. She's a virgin goddess. At the very least, I'm hoping Christians will stop calling her a fertility goddess. Whatever you want to do with my interpretation of the biblical text, please, historically, don't call Artemis a fertility goddess.
Right, yeah, and just to be 100% clear, so we are referring to the things that are on the level of her arms. I wish I could put like a little mouse on it. But yeah, so the people misinterpret that as like breasts. So she must be a fertility goddess, and there's other reasons, as you mentioned. But yeah, really interesting stuff. I mean, just no matter what your position on the women in ministry discussion is, that's really important to make sure that the views that you hold are actually historically accurate. So it's not like you were hitting on both sides or anything, or you were just promoting one specific view on the topic. And you were doing much more in your book, which I did appreciate. But yeah, any last words? Anything else you wanted to mention before we get going?
I hope that the one thing people take away historically is what I just mentioned, that Artemis is not a fertility goddess. But what I hope they would take away spiritually, and I think no matter where you stand on the role of women in ministry, I hope that what you take away spiritually is that Jesus is better than any stronghold, and he's more powerful than any stronghold, and he is God and Savior and Lord and first.
Amen. I appreciate that. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on.
Thank you. Did your homework? That's great questions. Appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. I'm trying my best, at least. Well, thank you so much for coming on here, Dr. Glahn. We'll definitely have to have you on for your future book, maybe. But otherwise, I do hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much.